do you think it's conceivable that in this country any government or devolved administration could legislate to say motorists can't overtake cyclists even on limited specified roads?
Welcome to Calling All Stations, the transport podcast. I'm Christian Wommer, an author and journalist who has covered transport for the past 30 years. In every episode, we try to keep you up to date with the most engaging news stories, policy developments, and interviews in the transport world. And with me is my regular co-presenter, Mark Walker, who has spent decades looking at transport policies and legislation. So, Mark, I think we've got a big agenda on today.
Yes, indeed, we have a packed programme today, Christian. So, hello to you and hello to our listeners. We'll be looking at the return to public ownership of Southwestern Railways and also some of the lessons that have already been learned from the earlier return to the public sector of TransPennine Express. You'll also be bringing listeners up to date with transport policies and initiatives in Belgium, with particular focus on cycling, a country that you've been visiting in the last few days as part of your ongoing world tour, it seems. We will then switch to focus on lawlessness in the transport system, and we'll be talking about pavement parking when it comes to roads and pedestrians, but also fare evasion, which is a topical issue right now in the public transport field. And then finally, we'll be updating listeners on the saga of the Heathrow power failure and the temporary closure of the airport earlier this year and the ongoing inquiries into how that happened.
Well, yes, a lot to get through. So we're going to try and keep it tight. But obviously, I think we had to start off with the transfer of Southwest trains from the private to the public sector. And now here's something quite funny, Mark, because I did this story 29 years ago when it went the other way. And indeed, I was on that very first train. And it was quite amusing because it was kind of about 5 o'clock in the morning and we were coming into Waterloo from Twickenham with Sir George Young and various grandees. And of course, when we arrived at Waterloo, there were a dozen kind of revenue inspectors, and all these people who are obviously used to taking this train and traveling for free got caught out. But the really funny
Well, that's
thing,
very topical, isn't it, actually, at the moment,
yes, we're
Christian?
going to discuss fare evasion later on.
Yeah.
But also very topical was the fact that this went down as the fact that the first train was in fact a bus replacement service. And ironically, 29 years ago, I wrote that the first privatized train was in fact a bus, and it was on the front page of the Independent, and it went from Fishguard to Swansea, where they'd replaced that end of that line with a bus, which then connected in with the train at Swansea. And I got enormous amounts of coverage for that. So it was really funny that the reverse happened, kind of history had kind of not quite repeated itself, but reversed itself.
I mean,
But anyway,
I think it's worth just pointing out, Christian, that in 29 years, so little has been learned in relation to public relations and the provision of transport services that somebody would allow the first nationalised train service to be a bus. I
I
mean,
know
it's extraordinary, isn't it?
yes, no, I had lunch with a mate yesterday who pointed that out straight away, Neil Lawson from Compass, and he said, oh God, he said the first train was a bus, wasn't it? Can't they do better than that? And I must say, you'd have thought they would have just made sure that it wasn't a bus. It would have required no effort whatsoever. But here we are. But it is a significant moment, and I did about 6 or 7 kind of radio interviews on it. I must say, I think I did a better PR job for the Labour government than they did themselves. Arguing that this was sensible, It wasn't going to change things immediately very much, but that in the long term, it leads to a more rational structure for the rail industry. That integration was the key. And to be fair to all the presenters who interviewed me, they largely agreed, actually, even on quite right wing kind of media like talk radio. They kind of understood that this did genuinely seem to be a better way of running a railway. And we have some evidence of that because, in a timely fashion, TransPennine Express released some figures about their improvements. It's been taken into public ownership in May 2023, and their statistics show that they reduced cancellations by 75%. Well, that's partly because the period they're talking about was when there was the drivers' dispute, and there were endless kind of cancellations because of that. But they've increased passenger journeys by 42% and grown revenue by 54%. And I must say, I went up there soon after they took over, and they do have an excellent MD, Chris Jackson, who was, really one of these people you could see was really cared, really knew how to run a railway, and so on. And that's a very key point about all this, is that we need the right people to run this. And I mean, I've seen that they've got Steve White to run the southern southeastern kind of alliance, and I think that will take in Southwest Trains as well. And he's an excellent guy. So they need these kind of strong leaders to ensure this happens. But Mark, I think there is a big risk here that the Labour government, as I've said this before, has put a lot of store by this renationalisation. It's kind of put it at the top of one of its kind of policies, and it has to work. So good on TransPennine Express for kind of turning its services around, but we have to see other improvements, and that's going to be more difficult because Southwest Trains was not a basket case. The TransPennine Express was a basket case. So they're going to have to show that this both brings about more effective services, but also crucial. And I was asked in every radio interview about this, about fares. And I think they're going to have to bite the bullet here. And the spending review in a couple of weeks' time will be interesting. But I think they have to bite the bullet here and ensure that we don't have massive fare rises, because it will be so obvious that an attack will then be, renationalised, but no, they're kind of fleecing the poor rail passenger again.
Yes, and of course that is partly determined by overall public spending decisions and the balance between taxpayer support and fair payer income that underpins the railway industry's finances, and those are very, very political decisions, as we
Yes,
saw as
but
recently as the budget last autumn with the fare increase that was included there.
yes, but there's a point here, Mark, that uh, it's an economic term, elasticity, which means really the rate at which passenger numbers will increase or decrease in relation to price, right? And there is a big question here that, if you do put up the fares by a lot, do you actually generate more income, or do you put so many people off? Given that rail journeys are comparatively expensive if there's two or three of you jumping in a car. So I think we should kind of have a policy of relatively cheap fares in order to get people out of their cars now. And whether that really requires subsidy or not is, a complicated question for economists. But I think it's not as simple as saying, well, you save money if you add 5% to the fares, you get 5% more revenue. Well, you
No,
don't.
indeed. There's definitely a deterrent effect there, isn't there? Yeah, I think it's probably worth reminding. I mean, many of our listeners will be familiar with this, but it's worth reminding everybody that the public ownership of Southwest Railway is the first of a programme, which the second step this summer is the return of the C2C contract to the public sector. So that's the one that operates from primarily from Fenchurch Street in the City of London through the Essex
The South End.
destinations and down to as far as Southend. And then in October, the government has announced that the Greater Anglia contract will end. So that's services primarily from Liverpool Street out into East Anglia to Cambridge, Kings Lynn, Norwich, and routes across East Anglia as well. And with a pledge in the government manifesto and underpinned by legislation to have all of the private sector contracts, what were the franchises, back in the public sector by the end of this parliamentary term. So we're going to get used to seeing lots of these kind of announcements, and perhaps some of them a little better managed, with the first service being delivered by a train rather than a replacement bus.
There will be a challenge too there, particularly Greater Anglia is actually a very good franchise.
Indeed.
With new, wonderful new Stadler trains, and apparently operates very well. So it's going to be a challenge, but it's one that we'll keep watching on Calling All Stations.
Christian, listeners will be familiar over recent episodes from your visits to many nations of the world. And most recently, you've been in Belgium. So, would you like to tell us about what you've experienced there?
Well, this was very interesting. I was on a study tour with London Cycling Campaign, where I used to be a trustee. And every year we cycle off to some destination where hopefully we'll learn stuff about how they're improving cycling. Last year we went to Paris, and this year we decided to go to Ghent and Bruges in Belgium. And I must say, one does learn just how different things are. I mean, first of all, getting there was a breeze. I mean, literally. Although at one point we were into the breeze, and that was fairly hard work on our way to Ostend. But nearly all of it was cycling next to canals on really well looked after paths. We sped along. That the main danger was, particularly on the Sunday, was the pelotons of cyclist clubs kind of charging at huge speeds, either in our direction or against us. They were quite terrifying. But otherwise, the standard of the cycle paths and the ability, the fact that you can cycle the 30 miles between Bruges and Ghent without ever going into on any serious road with major traffic or HGVs or whatever. Must be said that coming out of Dunkirk port is a nightmare amongst the the HGVs, and that it seems to be no way of avoiding that. But once we got out of Dunkirk, it was absolutely fantastic, and we learned really how both Ghent and Bruges, in their different ways, had helped create a cycling culture. But it wasn't only, particularly in Bruges, it wasn't really about cycling. It was about livability. So in Ghent, there's a big student town, and they've got lots of kind of emphasis on cycling, big cycling scheme. They have a thing called the local cycling embassy, which provides all sorts of services, which range from hiring out bikes to clearing out dead bikes and kind of getting them repaired and employing people to work on them, and then selling them or giving them away and stuff. I mean, it's a comprehensive cycling service, and they have a modal share of cycling of 34% inside the town. 34%. That means a third of all journeys are cycling, and actually, it felt like more when you were in the town. But the one innovation that I really would like policymakers to understand and learn about was the cycling street, right? So when you get streets where they're slow, a relatively low amount of traffic, maybe because you blocked off side streets or whatever, you've kind of reduced the amount of traffic. So they turn it into what they call a cycling street, and they put great big images on the road of a cycle in front of a car. And the key along those cycling streets is that the limit is 20 kilometers an hour. But also, crucially, cars are not allowed to pass cyclists, right? It's absolutely against the law for cars to pass cyclists. Now, the brilliance of this is that it doesn't require huge amounts of infrastructure change. You don't need cycle lanes. You don't need kind of to spend a lot of money kind of changing the road layout, but rather you just paint some symbols on the road, and you say, right, this is a cycling street. The cars can go along it, but the cyclists have priority. And of course, you're not going to do this on a totally main road, but it creates safe cycling. It slows the traffic down. It makes the area more livable, without actually having to spend much money on it. So that is the one innovation that I took away from both cities, that I really think we could transfer into this country.
Now that sounds great, but of course, any initiative like that in this country always seems to become a culture war, doesn't it, between the users of different modes and becomes a matter of political polarization. I mean, do you think it's conceivable that in this country any government or devolved administration could legislate to say motorists can't overtake cyclists even on limited specified roads?
Um,
It's a
Look, I
lovely
think we just
idea,
have to. I
but
think we just have to. Yeah, I mean, you're right. And look, don't think that these places were not subject to some opposition when they introduced these kind of slowing down the traffic, squeezing cars out of the town centre. Bruises squeezed cars out of the town centre by creating sort of four areas which you can't transfer between those areas without going back to the ring road and coming back in again. So what we might call 15-minute cities, and which, yes, have already caused,
ouch,
yes,
yes.
controversy in Oxford. But I think, given how well these things work when they're implemented, we could try this out. We could have a trial city. When I was on the Cycling England board, we did have kind of trial cities where we put money into to kind of for them to try out ideas. And I think we could do this. I thought Ipswich would be a perfect example where it's pretty flat. It could easily be, it's the right sort of size. You could just say, right, we're going to make this into a livable city. Don't mention cycling, don't mention LTNs, just make it, talk about livability, talk about child safety, talk about kind of, the positive aspects of this. And hopefully we could do it in a grown-up way. I know they probably don't have the Daily Mail over there, and they don't have this whole woke kind of anti-woke culture and stuff. But hopefully we are getting a bit over it, and we just have to have politicians with the courage to do it. I mean, the effects are amazing. I do think it would help if maybe Heidi Alexander, our esteemed transport secretary, went over to these places like us and had a look at them, and came back and reported on how lives are saved and so on. I mean, look, in Wales already they have saved lives by having a 20-mile-an-hour limit in most urban areas. I mean, the results are clear. We just have to be brave. Look at New York, Mark, where they put in basically a congestion zone charge, and the results have been absolutely stratospheric. Massive reductions in crashes. The traffic has been getting through, and of course, Trump so hates it, he's trying to stop it. I mean, we have to fight our way through this.
Yeah, another example of the polarization that tends to all too often follow around these
Yes.
issues. But thanks for the insight, Christian. I'm sure listeners will find that interesting. And of course, if Heidi Alexander wants to go and visit Belgium, you can create a route map, a guidebook for her.
Absolutely, and I would happily accompany her and introduce her to the wonderful people who gave us talks. And look, my favorite, just to leave you on, my favorite thing is that in one of the car park or cycle parks rather, where there are hundreds of cycles, there was a machine that dispensed cycle lights and cycle locks and an emergency kind of cycle chain fixer out of a machine. And I thought
Like a
that must be
vending
the
machine, a
most
vending
weirdest
machine.
kind of vending machine in the world.
Amazing. We're going to have a look now at some aspects of what might be called lawlessness on the transport system in the UK. And I was inspired to investigate this because of a question asked in the House of Commons to the transport ministers on the 15th of May by Liz Twist, the Member of Parliament for Blaydon, who asked for an update on what the government was doing to ban pavement parking by vehicles in across England. And this, when you delve into this, it's quite an interesting, in some respects, quite a sorry story, and possibly another example of the culture wars in transport that we were discussing just now in relation to cycling. Because if you track the history back, it's been 10 years since the then UK government ran its first consultation on the possibility of restricting or banning pavement parking in England. Just to explain what the current situation is, pavement parking is already banned throughout the entirety of Greater London. But for the rest of England, there is no specific law in place. In the rest of the UK, the position varies from nation to nation as well. So, generally, pavement parking has been banned in Scotland since 2019 by an act of the Scottish Parliament, but the implementation of this is being carried out by individual local authorities. There's very little has happened in relation to banning pavement parking in Wales or Northern Ireland. But there was this move back in 2015 to consult on the possibility of doing something throughout the rest of England outside London. And this was because an individual MP had introduced a private member's bill to ban pavement parking, and he'd been persuaded to drop this by the then government on the basis that they would run this consultation. So they did the consultation, and then essentially nothing happened.
For 10 years, for 10 years.
So yeah, well, it gets even better. It gets
Oh,
even better,
God.
Christian. So then in 2019, the House of Commons Transport Committee looked into this, and at the time, and this is significant, the House of Commons Transport Committee was chaired by Lillian Greenwood MP, the Labour Member of Parliament for Nottingham South. And they produced a report in 2019. Now, they received 430 pieces of evidence for this inquiry, which is an absolutely staggering number. And they made a series of recommendations on what to do about pavement parking. So, first of all, they said, let's have a national awareness campaign so that people recognise it's a bad and stupid thing to do. Now, as somebody who lives in a neighbourhood afflicted by pavement parking, I could say that would be actually be quite a helpful start, because a lot of people just park on the pavement without any thought at all about the impact on pedestrians and other pavement users, if I might describe them as that, and also on the perhaps the people's houses that they're parking right up against as well, and blocking access to their homes. So, national awareness campaign. Secondly, there are some powers that local authorities have through traffic regulation orders to regulate the and effectively impose local bans on pavement parking. So they said, let's simplify that process, make it easier to address problems. Um, they also recommended that pavement parking be decriminalised because one of the problems at the moment is that nobody actually enforces the limited law that is there to penalise motorists who are blocking the pavement and causing a public nuisance. Because, and I know this from experience, if you ring up the police, they'll refer you to the council, and if you ring the council, they'll refer you to the police.
So you don't
And
get you
so,
don't get policemen. Yeah, I mean,
so
you sometimes used to see in old films kind of policemen, saying, "Oh, you can't park here," and of
or
course,
issue a ticket, an
yeah, I issue
old-fashioned
a
kind
ticket,
of
and
ticket.
nobody
But
does
but
that
no,
anymore.
that generally doesn't happen, and because this is one aspect of parking enforcement which falls between the space, falls between the gaps um, between the various agencies. And they said their fourth recommendation was to clarify those enforcement responsibilities. They then said there should be a new civil offence of obstructive pavement parking should be introduced so that people could actually be prosecuted for this outside of London in England. And then they said the long-term plan should be to extend the London ban on pavement parking to the rest of England. So that was their report. It's 2019. They put this report into the UK government, and the UK government responds by running, you guessed it, another consultation.
Consultation, yes.
Okay, so they ran this conversation. Now, okay, we remember 2020, everything was kind of a bit disrupted by COVID, but nevertheless, they ran the consultation and it closed on the 22nd of November 2020. And that's the last we've heard of the consultation.
Now you're missing the punchline there, because what is Lillian Greenwood?
Well, this is where we come back to our House of Commons questions, because now Lillian Greenwood is the Minister for the Future of Roads. So Lillian Greenwood, whose committee produced this report in 2019, is now the Minister responsible for the very same issue and was being asked by Liz Twist what was happening and when would we see the response to the consultation carried out by the previous government. Now, this is where the culture wars aspect comes in, of course, because what have we had in the intervening period? During the latter stages of the Rishi Sunak government, as loyal listeners will remember, we had a pledge by Rishi Sunak to end the war on the motorist. And my hunch is that all of this was put into the bin effectively because it was seen as another aspect of the war on the motorist. So you shouldn't stop the motorists essentially parking on the pavements and be beastly to them.
Absolutely, that's really cruel.
So now we have an interesting case where not just a new government has to decide whether to shape up on this issue, but the very specific person who made those recommendations back in 2019 is now tasked with trying to carry them forward.
So what did she answer when she was asked about
She
this?
said she's looking into it. She says she's on the case. She's on the case, and I genuinely believe that would be the case with the truth with Lillian Greenwood. But it just goes to show how, and this leads us into the other part of our discussion today, Christian, how things can just become kind of accepted and taken for granted, and it is irresponsible to park your vehicle on the pavement and cause inconvenience and possibly danger to other users of the space, forcing pedestrians and perhaps children out into the road in order to get around your vehicle. But it's kind of tolerated. And this week, we've seen in quite spectacular fashion another politician from another party, address an issue which on public transport lawlessness, which perhaps also has been too easily tolerated.
Excuse me, do you think it's all right not to pay? Seriously, why do you go back through the barrier and pay? Do you want to go back and pay like everybody else? Do you think it's all right not to pay? Why don't you go back and pay? You can say off as much as you want, but everyone else has to pay. You're carrying a knife, you say? Nearly 1 in 25 people using London's public transport aren't paying for it.
Absolutely. We've had Robert Jenrick become a scourge of the fare dodgers. And I mean, obviously in a publicity stunt that was aimed to kind of push forward his leadership credentials. He was at Stratford Station, basically being filmed. It was obviously pre-planned, wearing a kind of checked shirt in kind of laid-back kind of clothes, stopping fare dodgers and talking to them and going up to them and saying, you know, why do you think you should be able to go through the barriers for free? We all pay our fares. And he was told to off a couple of times, and actually repeated it back, which was interesting. And then he asked one of these fare dodgers, alleged fare dodgers, have you got a knife on you? Which obviously didn't get any response, but I think he was trying to make himself out to be, very courageous. Now, look, he's a populist politician, kind of, making hay, and that's all very well. But I think one has to, basically agree that there is an issue here. Apparently, according to Transport for London's figures, fare dodging is about 3.4%. Apparently, it's down from 3.8%. I don't know how they work these figures out, but they want to halve it over the next few years to 1.5%. That's all very worthy, but I think there ought to be more of a visible presence. I mean, here's one of my bugbears, right, which is that they move people out the ticket offices onto the barriers, and I think that was a good idea. And most, apart from at places like King's Cross and whatever, I think that not having ticket offices, given that most people now pay by Oyster and contactless card and whatever, was a good idea. But then they put them in these little boxes, and they're all in these boxes next to the barriers, and they sit in those boxes the whole time, and there's no visible presence. It is quite easy to get through the barriers. They have these wider barriers on the London transport system, whereby you can basically, it gives you a longer interval to pull a suitcase through, but it means that somebody can just walk behind you and not pay the fare. So there are issues, and the people on the barrier tend not to do anything about that. Now, there's issues about being attacked, and I have every sympathy with them that we don't want them to put themselves at danger and so on. But I think there could be a bit more of a presence. And now I've just been in Paris, where this is a much bigger problem. I'm sure that the percentages were much higher because there are always people jumping across the barriers, and they have changed the nature of the barriers. So they've made them much higher. They've not got this little extra barrier that kind of stays open for long. But they don't have very many people on the barriers at all, which I think is a mistake. But so I think this is an issue that, Jenrick is right to highlight, but I don't think should be a populist kind of, us versus them. I mean, he used it to criticize the mayor, when the mayor is actually kind of the mayor, Sadiq Khan, is making efforts to deal with this. But I do think it's an issue that should attract more attention.
I think it's worth saying that Transport for London, which was the subject of Mr. Jenrick's initiative, announced at the end of April measures to halve fare evasion across all services. They say that the rate is in 2023-4 was 3.8% of revenue at that point, and it's currently down to 3.4%, and they want to halve that over, I think it's the next 5 years. So they do say that they have strategies in place. But these issues affect all public transport operators to varying degrees, and of course, but where it's so crucial is that if you're not capturing the revenue, it makes it harder to make the investment cases for the next range of our program of enhancements to the public transport system, as well as the general level of lawlessness and the deterrent effect of using the system and knowing that there are people on the system who have effectively broken the law by travelling for free. So what other means of breaking the law might they deploy during their time on the system? So it's
Absolutely, it makes the whole system seem, and certainly this is true of the Paris Metro, which is more threatening than the London Underground, definitely. That if you have lots of people who've been dodging the fares and they're kind of on the system with possibly some menace and so on. So it's all about making the system safer for everyone. And so I think that measures to deal with it are appropriate, and Jenrick has done a favour by actually highlighting it, even if he's just done it for narrow political purposes.
Here's Christian's final thought from the departure lounge.
Well, I'm sure that listeners will remember the recent fire at Heathrow in March, which I very fortunately missed by only 2 hours on my flight to India at the time. China, actually, sorry, China, I get lost. And we've had the first of 3 reports on this, but it's a bit of marking one's own homework here, because it was commissioned by Heathrow and it was carried out by Ruth Kelly, the former Secretary of State for Transport, who's now a consultant. And the big question was, how come the chief executive never responded when this happened? And apparently he was asleep, and there was kind of questions about this, and there was even suggestions that he had ignored the calls and so on. This was not the case. What he says now is, this is Thomas Woodby, who is the chief executive. He says he deeply regrets not being available at the time, but apparently what he says that although when he was phoned in the middle of the night, he hadn't turned his phone off, but apparently it had by itself kind of slipped into silent mode. As he said, it went into silent mode without him being aware of it. It had done so, and he was asleep at the time. So he missed several calls and lots of people calling him, and therefore the decisions had to be made by another executive rather than him. And he only kind of found out about it when he woke up in the morning. Now, I have a phone. I'm sure you do, Mark, as well. And mine does have a silent mode, but I have to press a button for it to go there. And sometimes I might forget that, particularly when I'm doing a broadcast like this, and then I forget to turn it back on again. But going into silent mode without him being aware of it, that's all a bit strange. So this whole thing has a little bit of, as I say, marking their own homework. And I'd like to see the future independent reports, which will be done by Ofgem and also another organisation over the next few months to look at what happens. But just to end on it, he says that it will require £1 billion to bring Heathrow's electrical system up to standard. And it's 75 years old, and that's why it kind of broke down, and it took a long time for the emergency ones to kick in and so on. But £1 billion, I mean, surely you could build a whole power station for £1 billion. I mean, I just, these numbers, why does everything cost so much in this country? And, why is it that, something as simple as increasing the electricity reliability cost £1 billion? So he said, well, that will then push fares up and the airlines won't like it and blah, blah, blah. So it's probably not going to happen.
Calling All Stations, the Transport Podcast with Christian Walmart, is produced by Cogitamus Limited, a leading provider of public affairs consultancy services in the sector. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, please consider giving us a 5-star rating with whichever platform you use. Do follow us on social media channels, including Blue Sky, Facebook, and X, formerly known as Twitter. Our handle on X is @AllStationsPod.